The cruelest betrayal is not the one you see, it's the one carefully hidden behind perfect smiles and quiet nights. The Manhattan skyline shimmered like a promise beneath the golden wash of a late autumn sunset, its glass towers catching the last light as if they were trying to hold on to something fleeting, something already slipping away. And high above the city, on the 42nd floor of a penthouse wrapped in marble and silence, Ava Carter stood before a wall of glass, her reflection merging with the endless stretch of lights below. Her fingers lightly grazing the stem of a crystal champagne flute that had long since gone untouched, the soft hum of the city rising like distant music, steady and indifferent, while inside, everything felt too still, too carefully composed, like a moment waiting to break. And tonight was supposed to be a celebration, their 7th wedding anniversary, a night Ava had planned down to the smallest detail. From the private chef preparing William's favorite dishes in the kitchen to the string quartet she had arranged to arrive just after 8, each note meant to echo the life they had built together, a life that from the outside looked flawless, enviable even, the kind of marriage people pointed to and whispered about with admiration, the kind that seemed untouched by doubt, untouched by cracks, untouched by truth, and yet as Ava adjusted the sleeve of her black silk dress, the fabric catching the soft light like liquid shadow, there was something in the air she couldn't quite name, a subtle shift. Like the pause before a storm that hadn't yet announced itself, and she inhaled slowly, steady, controlled, the way she had learned to be in a world that rewarded composure over chaos. Because Ava Carter did not unravel, she observed, she understood, she endured, her dark eyes scanning the city as if searching for an answer that hadn't yet revealed itself, while across the room, her phone rested silently on the marble counter, no new messages, no missed calls. Nothing but the quiet absence of the man who should have been standing beside her, William Hayes, her husband, the billionaire whose name carried weight in every boardroom from New York to San Francisco. The man who had once looked at her as though she were the only thing in the world that mattered, the man who now existed mostly in scheduled calls and carefully timed appearances, always present enough to maintain the illusion, never close enough to question it, and earlier that evening, his voice had come through the phone smooth and familiar, apologizing in that same measured tone, saying he was still tied up overseas, that a last-minute deal had delayed his return, that he hated missing tonight, hated disappointing her, and Ava had smiled as she listened. Her voice calm, reassuring, telling him she understood that business came first, that they could celebrate when he got back, because that was who she had become in this marriage, the understanding wife, the composed partner, the woman who never asked for too much, never pressed too hard, never forced the truth into the open, but as the call ended and the silence returned, something lingered, something unspoken, a faint echo that didn't quite sit right. Like a note slightly off in an otherwise perfect melody, and she turned slightly, her gaze falling on the long dining table set with precision, candles unlit, plates untouched, everything waiting, always waiting, and for a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to feel it, that quiet weight pressing against her chest, not pain, not yet, but awareness, subtle and sharp, and then she exhaled, slow, deliberate, placing the glass down with care, because if there was one thing Ava Carter had mastered, it was the art of holding everything together, even when something beneath the surface had already begun to fracture, even when somewhere in this same city, unknown to her, another life was unfolding in shadows, a life that had been carefully hidden, carefully protected, a truth that had not yet stepped into the light, and as the skyline darkened and the first stars struggled to appear beyond the glow of the city, Ava remained exactly where she was, poised, elegant, unshaken, unaware that tonight was not the celebration of a marriage, but the beginning of its quiet unraveling. A perfect lie does not need to be loud, it only needs to be consistent. The night deepened over Manhattan as the city lights sharpened into diamonds against the dark, each window telling a story Ava Carter could not hear, could not see, and somewhere within that vast network of glowing towers, one truth moved quietly beneath the surface of her carefully constructed life, unnoticed but very much alive, while inside the penthouse, time seemed to stretch in long, elegant pauses, the untouched dinner now cooling beneath silver covers, the string quartet dismissed before they ever had a chance to play, their absence leaving behind a silence that felt intentional, almost curated, and Ava moved through it with the same grace she carried everywhere, her heels soft against marble, her posture steady, her expression composed. Because nothing about her suggested uncertainty, nothing about her suggested doubt, and yet, as she reached for her phone again, there was a flicker of something new in her eyes, not suspicion, not yet, but awareness sharpening into focus, the kind that did not come from one moment but from many, small and precise, aligning into something that could no longer be ignored. And earlier that week, William had called from what he claimed was Zurich, his voice smooth, controlled, telling her about meetings that stretched late into the night, about investors who needed reassurance, about numbers that required his attention, and Ava had listened, asking just enough questions to sound engaged, never enough to sound doubtful, because she had learned long ago that the truth often revealed itself not through confrontation but through patience, through watching what people did not say, through noticing what they thought no one would see, and it had started subtly, a detail here, a delay there. A shift so slight it could be dismissed if one was not paying attention, but Ava always paid attention. She noticed the way his calls had become shorter, more precise, as though every word had been rehearsed. She noticed the time differences that did not quite align with the cities he claimed to be in. She noticed the background silence that felt too quiet for busy European offices, too controlled, too deliberate, and she said nothing, because saying nothing gave her something far more valuable than answers. It gave her clarity. And across the city, in a private medical facility, tucked discreetly between glass and steel, another version of William Hayes existed, one without distance, one without hesitation, a man who stood at the foot of a hospital bed with his jacket draped over the back of a chair, his sleeves rolled just enough to suggest presence rather than obligation, his attention fixed on the woman resting there, Lily Monroe, whose hand he held with a steadiness that spoke of something more than courtesy. Something that had been built in quiet moments, hidden conversations, decisions made behind closed doors, and beside them, a clipboard rested on a table, its pages filled with careful notes, appointment schedules, and one detail that carried more weight than any contract he had ever signed, a due date circled in ink, bold and undeniable, a future that had already begun to take shape. And William's voice here was different, softer, less measured. The edges of control eased into something that resembled care, as he reassured Lily in low tones, promising that everything was handled, that she would have the best doctors, the best privacy, that no one would interfere, that no one would know. And when she asked about his wife, the question barely above a whisper, his answer came without hesitation, calm, final, practiced. "She does not need to know." And those 6 words settled into the room like a decision already made, like a line drawn not in anger but in intention, because this was not chaos. This was design, every detail arranged, every movement calculated, every risk accounted for, including the one person who should have been at the center of it all. And back in the penthouse, Ava paused near the floor-to-ceiling windows once more, her reflection now framed by the full darkness of the city, the lights sharper, colder, more revealing, and she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond sound. Something beneath the surface, her mind moving through the fragments she had collected, the inconsistencies, the timing, the subtle shifts that no longer felt random, and then, almost instinctively, she reached for her laptop resting on the console, opening it with a quiet precision that mirrored everything about her, the screen lighting up her face as her fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a second before beginning to move, not hurried, not uncertain, but deliberate. Because Ava Carter did not chase the truth, she uncovered it piece by piece, layer by layer, until it stood in front of her with nowhere left to hide, and somewhere across the same city, William Hayes believed his life remained perfectly divided, perfectly controlled, unaware that the silence he had built around his secret was no longer protection, it was the very thing that would lead her straight to it. Sometimes the truth does not arrive with noise, it arrives in the smallest detail you almost overlook. Morning light slipped quietly into the penthouse, pale and restrained, stretching across the marble floors and settling into corners that had witnessed years of carefully curated perfection, and Ava Carter stood by the kitchen island with a cup of coffee untouched in her hands, her reflection faint in the polished stone as she watched the city begin its routine below, taxis threading through traffic, people moving with purpose. Lives unfolding without hesitation, while hers had entered a space that felt suspended, as though time itself was waiting for her to notice something she could no longer ignore, and the laptop remained open beside her, its screen filled with information she had gathered the night before, flight records, timestamps, fragments that once meant nothing now aligning with a precision that felt almost inevitable. And she did not rush, she never rushed, because rushing meant reacting, and Ava did not react. She understood, she traced patterns the way others followed. Instincts, and what she saw was not chaos, it was structure. William had not been careless, he had been deliberate, every trip spaced just enough to avoid overlap, every call placed at times that suggested distance without confirming it, every absence explained with logic that made questioning seem unnecessary. And yet the numbers did not lie, the coordinates did not shift, and one location appeared more often than any other. New York, always New York, even when he claimed to be across an ocean. And Ava exhaled slowly, setting the cup down with a soft sound that echoed more than it should have, because the realization was no longer forming, it had arrived, quiet and complete, and behind her, the soft footsteps of Mrs. Eleanor Grant approached with the familiarity of years, the housekeeper moving with the grace of someone who understood the rhythm of this home better than anyone else, her presence steady, almost invisible, and yet this morning there was something different in the way. She paused just a second too long, something unspoken pressing against the silence, and Ava turned slightly, her gaze meeting Mrs. Grant's for just a moment, long enough to notice the hesitation, the flicker of conflict carefully hidden behind professional composure, and it was subtle, so subtle that most would miss it, but Ava did not miss anything, especially not now, and she said nothing at first, allowing the silence to stretch, to reveal, to invite what words might conceal, and Mrs. Grant lowered her eyes, placing a neatly folded set of documents on the counter, her movements precise, but her hands betraying a tension that had no place in routine, and Ava's attention shifted to the papers, her fingers brushing the top page as she glanced down, not searching, simply observing, and there it was, not hidden, not obvious, but present enough to be seen by someone who knew where to look, a hospital logo. Printed in understated gray, a name partially visible beneath it, Monroe, and Ava's eyes lingered just long enough to register, not long enough to react, because reaction would change everything, and she was not ready to change anything yet, she was still gathering, still understanding the full shape of what had been constructed around her, and she lifted her gaze again, meeting Mrs. Grant's eyes with a calm that felt almost disarming. "Is there something you need to tell me?" Her voice was soft, even, without accusation, without urgency, just a question placed gently into the space between them, and for a moment, the older woman's composure wavered, the weight of something unsaid pressing against her silence, but years of loyalty and fear held her steady, and she shook her head slightly, offering a polite, practiced response that revealed nothing and everything at once. "No, ma'am." And Ava nodded once, as though accepting the answer at face value, though her mind had already moved beyond it, already connecting the name, the location, the pattern that no longer required confirmation, and Mrs. Grant stepped away, her footsteps retreating into the quiet of the apartment, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before, because now it carried knowledge, not assumption, and Ava remained where she was, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her expression unchanged. But something within her had shifted, something fundamental, because the illusion had not shattered, it had dissolved, revealing what had always been there beneath the surface, and she closed the laptop slowly, deliberately, as if sealing something away rather than opening it, because the truth was no longer something she needed to search for, it was something she now possessed, and across the city, in a room filled with soft white light and quiet reassurances, William Hayes continued his carefully divided life, unaware that the distance he had created had collapsed in a single moment, unaware that the silence he had relied on had just spoken louder than any confession ever could. The most dangerous truth is the one you carry alone, because it changes you before anyone else even knows it exists. The afternoon light stretched longer across the city, casting sharp reflections against glass and steel as Ava Carter stepped out of the black town car and onto the quiet sidewalk of a private medical building tucked discreetly between two towering offices, its exterior unremarkable, almost intentionally forgettable, the kind of place designed for those who value privacy above everything else, and she paused for just a moment, her gaze lifting to the upper floors as if measuring the distance between what she knew and what she was about to confirm, her posture still elegant, her expression calm, but there was a precision in the way she moved now, a clarity that had replaced uncertainty. Because she was no longer searching for answers, she was verifying them, and inside, the air was cool and controlled, the reception area quiet with soft music playing low enough to be almost imperceptible. The receptionist offering a polite smile that Ava returned with equal grace, her voice steady, as she provided a name she had memorized, not her own, but one that had already begun to reshape her reality, Lily Monroe, and the smallest flicker of recognition crossed the receptionist's face before professionalism settled back into place, a confirmation that required no further explanation, and Ava nodded slightly, as though she had expected nothing less. Her heels carrying her forward through the hallway lined with muted artwork and closed doors, each step measured, each breath even. Because there was power in control, and she intended to hold on to it for as long as possible, and then she saw him, not in a dramatic moment, not in some explosive confrontation, but in something far quieter, far more devastating. William Hayes standing near the window at the end of the corridor, his back partially turned, his posture relaxed in a way she had not seen in months. His attention focused entirely on the woman seated beside him, Lily Monroe, whose presence felt both unfamiliar and unmistakably real, her hand resting lightly against her stomach in a gesture that carried meaning without needing words, and William's hand covering hers with a familiarity that spoke of time, of shared moments Ava had never witnessed, never been invited into, and Ava stopped, not abruptly, not with shock, but with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if her body understood before her mind needed to react, and she watched, just for a second, long enough to see the truth unfold without interruption, long enough to notice the softness in his expression. The way his voice lowered when he spoke, the way he leaned in just slightly as if nothing else in the world existed beyond that moment, and something inside Ava shifted, not breaking, not collapsing, but aligning, because this was not confusion, this was clarity, absolute and undeniable, and she did not step forward, she did not call his name, she did not create a scene that would give him the opportunity to explain, because explanations were no longer necessary. The truth had already spoken for itself in the simplest of gestures, and she turned quietly, her heels making no more sound than they had when she arrived, her exit as controlled as her entrance, because this was not the moment for confrontation, this was the moment for understanding, and understanding required distance, required silence, required the kind of strength that did not demand recognition, and as she walked back through the hallway, past the reception desk, past the soft music and the polite smiles, nothing about her suggested what she had just seen, nothing about her revealed the shift that had just taken place beneath the surface, and outside, the city carried on as it always did, unaware, indifferent, the noise of traffic and distant voices blending into a familiar rhythm, and Ava stepped back into it without hesitation, her expression composed, her gaze forward, but her mind already moving ahead, already calculating, already redefining what came next. Because the woman who had entered that building was not the same woman who was now walking away from it, and across the glass walls. Above, William Hayes remained exactly where he was, unaware that the life he believed he controlled had just slipped beyond his reach, unaware that the silence he had relied on was no longer protecting him, but quietly preparing to dismantle everything he thought was secure. Silence is not weakness, it is preparation. The car door closed with a soft, deliberate click as Ava Carter settled into the back seat, the city moving around her in steady motion, while she remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed forward, her reflection faint against the tinted glass as the skyline shifted in fragments of light and shadow, and for a moment, nothing existed except the quiet rhythm of her breathing, slow, controlled, intentional, because what she had just seen did not shatter her, it refined her. It stripped away illusion and left only truth, clean and undeniable, and truth required action, not reaction, and she leaned back slightly, her fingers resting lightly on her lap, no trembling, no hesitation, because Ava Carter did not fall apart in the presence of betrayal. She reorganized, she recalculated, she rebuilt, and by the time the car reached the penthouse, something inside her had already settled into place, a calm that was not born from peace, but from clarity. And the elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt shorter than usual, as if time itself had adjusted to match her pace, and when the doors opened, the familiar space greeted her with the same polished stillness it always had, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like a structure she had once belonged to, something she now observed from a distance even while standing inside it, and she walked through it without pause, her heels echoing softly against marble, past the untouched dining table, past the carefully arranged details of a life that had been built on something that no longer existed, and she did not stop until she reached William's study, a room that had always been closed to anything except order and control, a space where every document, every decision, every secret had its place, and she stepped inside with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed permission, her eyes moving across the room with precision, taking in the desk, the shelves, the subtle details that had once been background but now held potential answers, and she did not search wildly, she did not open everything at once, she moved methodically, drawer by drawer, file by file, because chaos belonged to those who had nothing left to lose. And Ava still had everything, she just needed to redefine what everything meant, and it did not take long, because William had always believed in control more than concealment. He had hidden his actions in plain sight, assuming no one would question what appeared consistent, and there it was, a set of documents tucked neatly among business reports, nothing labeled suspicious, nothing overtly personal, but enough to confirm what she already knew: medical invoices, private arrangements, payments that traced a line directly back to the building she had just left, each detail precise, each record intentional, and Ava stood there for a moment, the papers resting lightly in her hands, her expression unchanged, because this was not discovery, this was confirmation, and confirmation did not require emotion, it required decision, and she placed the documents back exactly where she had found them, not a single page out of place, because this was not about exposing him. Not yet. This was about understanding the full scope of what he had done, and more importantly, what she would do next. And as she stepped out of the study, her gaze drifted briefly toward the large windows overlooking the city, the same skyline that had once symbolized everything they had built together, now reflecting something entirely different, something sharper, something more defined, and she reached for her phone, her movements smooth, unhurried, as she scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she needed, a financial advisor who had worked with her independently for years, someone who understood discretion as well as strategy, and when the call connected, her voice was calm, steady, leaving no room for interpretation. I need to review all personal accounts and restructure my holdings immediately. There was no explanation, no hesitation, just a clear directive, and on the other end, the response came quickly, professional, prepared, because people like Ava did not make requests like this without reason, and when the call ended, she set the phone down gently, her reflection once again catching her attention in the glass. But this time, it was different, not the woman who had been waiting for her husband, not the woman who had believed in the version of her life she had been given, but someone else entirely, someone who had seen the truth and chosen not to break, but to rise. And somewhere across the city, William Hayes continued his carefully managed reality, unaware that while he had been building a second life in secret, Ava had already begun dismantling the one he thought she would never leave. The moment you stop asking questions is the moment you start taking control. The following morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost surgical, the kind of light that revealed rather than softened, pouring through the glass walls of the penthouse and illuminating every surface with an honesty that could not be ignored, and Ava Carter moved through it with quiet precision, already dressed in a tailored ivory suit that replaced the softness of the night before with something sharper, something defined, her heels marking a steady rhythm across the marble as she crossed the living space, not as someone waiting, but as someone deciding, because waiting had ended the moment she saw the truth with her own eyes, and now every action carried intention, every movement aligned with a direction that only she fully understood. And in the kitchen, Mrs. Eleanor Grant stood preparing breakfast with the same careful attention she had shown for years. But the air between them had changed, no longer neutral, no longer invisible. It carried the weight of what had been seen and what had been left unsaid, and Ava paused just at the edge of the room, watching for a brief second, long enough to acknowledge the presence of the woman who had unknowingly become part of a silence that no longer held power over her, and then she stepped forward, her voice calm, measured, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Mrs. Grant, I will not be needing anything today." And the older woman turned, her expression polite but uncertain, as if sensing something beneath the words that she could not quite name, and Ava held her gaze just long enough to remove any ambiguity, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity, a quiet authority that did not need to raise its volume to be understood. And Mrs. Grant nodded slowly, stepping back, because some shifts in a household did not need to be explained, they could be felt, and Ava continued past her without pause, picking up her phone as she moved toward the elevator, her next call already forming in her mind, and when it connected, her tone remained steady, composed, but unmistakably decisive. "I want a full legal review of my marriage agreement, all clauses, all contingencies, effective immediately." There was no hesitation, no explanation, just a directive that carried the weight of finality, and on the other end, her attorney responded with professional readiness, understanding that this was not a casual request, and Ava ended the call as the elevator doors closed, her reflection catching in the mirrored walls, her posture straight, her expression calm, but her eyes sharper now, more focused, because this was no longer about what had been done to her. It was about what she would do next, and as she stepped out onto the street, the city moved around her with its usual urgency. Unaware that within its vast network of lives and decisions, one quiet transformation was unfolding, one that would not announce itself with noise, but with results. And across town, in the same private medical building, William Hayes stood near the window once more, his attention divided between his phone and the room behind him, where Lily Monroe rested, her presence now part of a future he had already begun to shape, and his voice carried the same controlled confidence as he spoke into the phone, discussing timelines, arrangements, ensuring that every detail remained contained, that every risk remained managed, because control had always been his strength, his certainty, and he believed it remained intact. And when he ended the call, he glanced briefly at his watch, calculating his return, the narrative he would present, the version of reality he would maintain, and nothing in his expression suggested doubt, nothing suggested that anything had shifted beyond his reach. Because he did not yet understand that while he had been constructing a second life with careful precision, Ava had already begun dismantling the foundation of the first, and back in the flow of the city, she stepped into another waiting car, her movements fluid, unhurried, as she gave a single instruction to the driver, an address that did not belong to the life she was leaving behind, but to the one she was beginning to build. And as the car pulled away, the skyline reflected in the window once more, no longer a symbol of what she had shared, but a backdrop to what she was about to become, because Ava Carter was no longer the woman who had been kept in the dark, she was the woman who had chosen to step into the light on her own terms, and the difference between those two versions of her would soon become impossible for anyone, especially William Hayes, to ignore. The most powerful exit is the one no one sees coming until it is already complete. The afternoon carried a different weight now, not heavy, not uncertain, but precise, as if every hour had been sharpened into purpose, and Ava Carter stepped into the private conference room overlooking downtown Manhattan with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to prove her place, her presence alone enough to shift the energy of the space. The floor-to-ceiling windows casting long lines of light across the polished table where three executives already waited, their posture straight, their expressions attentive, because they understood who she was even if they did not yet understand what she was about to become, and Ava did not waste time on introductions or unnecessary pleasantries, her voice calm, measured, carrying the same composure that had once defined her role as a wife but now redefined her as something entirely different. "I want full acquisition analysis on Hayes Global's secondary holdings, specifically the divisions he considers non-essential." The words landed with quiet impact, not aggressive, not emotional, but strategic, and one of the executives leaned forward slightly, surprised not by the request itself, but by the clarity behind it, because this was not curiosity, this was intent, and Ava's gaze remained steady, her fingers resting lightly against the table, her posture relaxed but controlled, as if she had already mapped out every move that would follow, and outside, the city continued its constant motion, unaware that within this room, the balance of power was beginning to shift in a way that would soon ripple far beyond it, and hours later, as the meeting concluded, Ava stepped back into the elevator alone, the soft hum of its descent matching the rhythm of her thoughts, each detail aligning, each decision building towards something larger, something irreversible, and when the doors opened to the lobby, her phone vibrated once. A message appearing on the screen that carried no urgency but held undeniable significance. William Hayes had landed in New York, and Ava paused for just a fraction of a second, her eyes scanning the words before locking the screen again, her expression unchanged, because this was not unexpected, this was inevitable, and across the city, William moved through his own version of certainty, stepping out of his car with the same controlled confidence that had defined his entire career. His suit perfectly tailored, his presence commanding without effort, and as he entered the penthouse later that evening, everything appeared exactly as it always had, the space immaculate, the air still, the quiet suggesting normalcy. And for a moment, he allowed himself to believe it, that nothing had shifted, that everything remained within his control, and he set his keys down on the console, loosening his tie slightly as he called out Ava's name, his voice carrying through the open space. Expecting a response that did not come, and he frowned slightly, not in concern, but in mild confusion, because silence in this home had always been peaceful, never empty, and he moved further inside, his steps slower now, his gaze scanning the room with a focus that had not been necessary before, and then he saw it, not chaos, not confrontation, but absence, subtle, precise, the way certain personal items were no longer where they had always been. The way the space felt intact but no longer inhabited in the same way, and on the marble table, a single envelope rested. Placed exactly at the center, not hidden, not dramatic, simply present, and William approached it with a measured step, his hand reaching out with the same confidence he applied to everything else. But something in the stillness of the room began to shift around him, something he could not yet define, and as he opened the envelope, his eyes moved quickly across the document inside, the words clear, structured, unmistakable. Legal review initiated. Asset separation in progress, and for the first time, the certainty he had carried began to fracture, not loudly, not completely, but enough to register, enough to interrupt the narrative he had constructed, and he lowered the paper slightly, his gaze lifting to the empty space around him, the silence now different, no longer passive, but intentional, and somewhere across the city, Ava Carter stepped out of another car, her reflection catching in the glass of a building that did not belong to her past, her posture steady, her expression composed, because this was not an escape, this was a transition, and the life she had once been part of was no longer something she needed to confront, it was something she had already begun to outgrow, and the distance between her and William Hayes was no longer measured in miles or silence, it was measured in power, in clarity, in the quiet certainty that she had already moved 3 steps ahead, and he was only just beginning to realize that he had been left behind. Regret does not arrive when you lose someone, it arrives when you realize they no longer need you. The night settled over Manhattan with a sharp clarity, the kind that turned every reflection into a mirror and every silence into a question, and inside the penthouse, William Hayes stood alone in a space that had never felt unfamiliar until now, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass while the room behind him felt subtly altered, not through chaos or absence of structure, but through intention. The kind of absence that was chosen, not accidental, and he moved slowly, his steps measured as if trying to recalibrate his understanding of a place he had always controlled, his gaze scanning the details that once required no attention, the arrangement of furniture unchanged, the art still aligned perfectly on the walls, and yet something essential had shifted, something he could not immediately define but could no longer ignore, and he picked up his phone, his movements precise. Dialing Ava's number with the same confidence he applied to every situation that required resolution, but the call rang once, twice, and then redirected to voicemail, her voice calm and composed even in absence, a recorded version of the woman he believed he still understood, and his jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something more unfamiliar, disruption, because Ava had never been unavailable, never unreachable, never outside the structure he had come to rely on. And he ended the call without leaving a message, his mind already moving ahead, already constructing explanations, reasons, ways to restore the balance he assumed had only momentarily shifted, and across the city, in a private rooftop venue overlooking the Hudson River, Ava Carter stood beneath a different kind of light, one that did not belong to the past she had left behind, but to the future she was actively shaping. The soft glow of chandeliers reflecting against polished surfaces as voices moved around her in quiet conversation, executives, investors, individuals who recognized power not through noise, but through presence, and Ava moved among them with effortless control, her black dress replaced by a deep crimson gown that caught the light with every step, not as decoration, but as declaration, a visual shift that mirrored everything she had become. In such a short span of time, and when she spoke, her words were measured, intentional, each sentence carrying weight without needing emphasis, because this was not performance, this was alignment, and the woman standing here was not reacting to what she had lost, she was building something that could not be taken from her again, and one of the investors leaned in slightly, his tone respectful. "Your timing is impressive, Mrs. Carter." And Ava met his gaze with a calm confidence that required no correction, no explanation of titles or relationships, because she was no longer defined by the name she had carried within William's world, she was defining her own. "Timing is not luck," she replied softly. "It is awareness." And the conversation moved forward, strategies unfolding, opportunities aligning, while behind her composed exterior, every decision she had made in the past 48 hours continued to expand, each one reinforcing the next, building a structure that stood independent of everything she had once relied on. And back in the penthouse, William poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light as he stared at his own reflection in the darkened window, his expression controlled but no longer untouched, because something had slipped beyond his reach, something he had not accounted for, and he replayed the sequence in his mind, the call, the empty space, the document on the table, the silence that had replaced what should have been confrontation, and that silence unsettled him more than any argument ever could, because it left no room for negotiation, no space to reassert control, and he picked up his phone again, this time scrolling through recent updates, financial alerts, notifications that had once been routine but now carried new significance, and there it was, subtle but undeniable, movements within accounts, shifts in holdings. Actions that required authorization only Ava possessed, and for the first time, the full scope of what was happening began to take shape, not as a sudden collapse, but as a precise, calculated transition, one he had not initiated, one he could not easily reverse, and he set the glass down with a controlled motion, his eyes narrowing slightly as the realization settled in. Ava was not reacting, she was moving, and she was doing so without him, beyond him, and across the city, under the soft glow of lights that reflected against the river. Ava Carter stepped away from the conversation for a brief moment, her gaze lifting toward the skyline that had once symbolized everything she had shared with a man who believed control was permanent, and she allowed herself a single breath, steady, grounding, before her expression returned to its calm, composed state, because this was not the end of something, it was the beginning of everything she had yet to become. And the difference between those two realities would soon become impossible for William Hayes to ignore. The greatest power is not in winning someone back, it is in no longer needing them to return. The night unfolded into something quieter, deeper, as the rooftop lights softened into a golden haze and the conversations around Ava Carter settled into a rhythm of respect rather than curiosity. Because the shift was no longer subtle, it was visible, tangible, the way people adjusted their tone when speaking to her, the way attention followed her movements without being demanded. And Ava stood at the edge of the terrace for a moment, the Hudson River stretching beneath her like a dark ribbon of reflection, the city rising behind her in layers of light that no longer represented what she had lost, but what she had stepped beyond, and her phone remained silent in her hand, not because there were no messages, but because she had already chosen which ones mattered, and across the city, William Hayes stood in the center of a reality that was no longer responding to him the way it always had. The notifications continuing to arrive, each one precise, each one confirming that Ava's actions were not emotional, they were strategic, accounts adjusted, access restructured, decisions executed with a clarity that left no space for reversal, and for the first time, he did not reach for control, he reached for understanding, his mind tracing backward through every moment he had dismissed, every detail he had overlooked, until it led him to the one truth he could no longer avoid: she had known. And she had chosen not to confront him, not to argue, not to demand explanations, but to move. And that realization carried a weight far greater than any accusation ever could, because it meant he had lost something before he even realized it was at risk, and he picked up his phone once more, his movements slower, now less certain, as he dialed her number again, the call connecting this time not to voicemail, but to a brief silence that stretched just long enough to register, and then her voice, calm, composed, unchanged in tone but entirely different in meaning. Yes. And William paused for a fraction of a second, the words simple, controlled, yet carrying a distance he had never heard before, and he spoke carefully, his voice steady but lacking its usual certainty. "Ava, we need to talk." And there was no hesitation in her response, no emotion layered into the words, just clarity. "There is nothing left to discuss." And the silence that followed was not empty, it was final, and William exhaled slowly, his grip tightening slightly around the phone as he tried to regain the structure he had always relied on. "You are overreacting. Whatever you think you saw, we can handle this." But Ava's voice did not shift, did not rise, did not break. It remained exactly as it had been, calm, precise, untouchable. "I am not reacting, William, I am responding." And the distinction settled between them with a quiet force, redefining everything he had assumed, and she continued before he could interrupt, her tone steady, each word placed with intention. "You built something in secret and expected silence to protect you, but silence does not protect, it reveals, and now I have seen everything I need to see." And for the first time, William had no immediate response, no calculated argument, no controlled explanation, because this was not a situation he could negotiate. This was a conclusion she had already reached, and on the rooftop, Ava turned slightly, the wind catching the edge of her crimson dress as she looked out over the city one last time, her reflection faint in the glass barrier beside her, not as a memory of who she had been, but as confirmation of who she had become. And she spoke again. Her voice softer now, but no less certain. "You did not lose me because of what you did, you lost me because of what I realized." And the words carried no anger, no accusation, only truth, and that truth was something William could not reshape, could not control, and the line went quiet for a moment before she added the final piece, the sentence that closed everything without needing anything more, and "I do not go back to places where I was kept in the dark." And with that, she ended the call, not abruptly, not emotionally, but with the same precision that had defined every step she had taken since the moment she saw the truth, and she lowered the phone slowly, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, because this was not an ending marked by loss, it was one defined by clarity, and as she stepped back into the light of the gathering behind her, the city continued to move, unaware that somewhere within its endless motion, a quiet shift had just been completed, one that did not require recognition to be powerful, because Ava Carter had not just walked away from a life built on illusion, she had stepped into one built entirely on her own terms, and the silence she carried with her was no longer something imposed, it was something she owned, something she had transformed into strength, into direction, into a future that no longer depended on anyone else to exist.